Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So today we're going to be talking about how to submit short stories to literary magazines. Submitting and publishing in literary magazines is a very viable way to get your work out there. It can help you start to build a name and audience for yourself. And if you're planning to go on to publish a collection later, it can be a really important step in eventually publishing that entire manuscript. Luckily, the process of submitting it to literary magazines is actually quite straightforward. And once you get it figured out, it'll pretty much be second nature. So the first step is to research your submission options. There are a ton of literary magazines out there, like literally hundreds, but not all of them are going to be the right fit for your work. In fact, a lot of them you may not even be eligible for. Now, some magazines have specific parameters. For example, they only accept work by authors who live in a certain area, or are of a certain age, or are of a certain demographic, etc., etc. Others only accept certain types of work. For example, they only publish work within a very certain word count, or of a very specific genre, or even of a very specific topic. Others don't really have these types of parameters, but you still need to research the magazine to see if your work is going to be a good fit. So they may not lay out in their submission guidelines or their mandate, hey, we only publish work like this, or work by this subset of authors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to go. So here are a few things to consider when you're researching literary magazines. First of all is the magazine's mission statement, format, and reach. Read their mission statement, their mandate, their about, see what type of work they're interested in, and the entire goal behind their publication. Do their values align with yours, and does the type of work they're interested in align with what you write? Would they be somewhere that you would be proud to showcase your work? You also want to look at the format. Most magazines will either be online, print, or a combination of both. Now, there is no better or worse. There are different perks to being published in print or online. Being published online means you'll likely have a much greater reach, but being published in print means that the magazine will go directly to all of the magazine's print subscribers, and print magazines also typically pay more. So usually you'll find that the print magazines are a bit more established, maybe kind of like long-term running magazines, and online magazines are a bit newer, so they have that online reach rather than that like long-time print subscriber base. So it's just kind of different. Both are great, and neither is better or worse. It just depends on what you're interested in for this piece. And then of course you also want to think about the magazine's reach. So a great way to get a sense of how established a magazine is to look at their social media following. How many followers do they have? The only place where this can be a little inaccurate is if you have really old print magazines. Some really old print magazines, like ones that have been around for decades, don't have huge social media followings because most of their reach is in their print subscriber base. You also, of course, want to look at the word count. This is really important. Word count can be a huge factor in researching magazines because if you're out of the word count, then you simply can't submit to them. So it's good to find a pool of magazines that are going to work for this piece, but also look for magazines that can fit a range of different pieces. Generally, you'll find that the longer your short story gets, the harder it's going to be to submit. No, it's going to be harder to submit a 6,000 word story than a 5,000 word story, and it's going to be harder to submit a 7,000 word story than a 6,000 word story, etc., etc. Usually every 1,000 words you add, or even every 500 words you add, you do lose submission options. So writing shorter pieces will definitely be to your benefit. You also want to think about the magazine's submission windows. Some magazines are just open year-round, others have distinct submission windows. So if a magazine seems like a good fit but isn't open now, make a note of it later so you can submit when they're open to submissions. A really important thing is to look at the work they've previously published. If they have samples online, read several pieces, and if they're a print magazine, then order a sample issue. A lot of libraries carry literary magazines. This is the best way to know if a magazine is going to be a good fit. If you read a couple pieces and it just seems very different from what you write, it probably won't be a good fit. It's not like you need to find a piece in a magazine that is super similar in concept, but in terms of general style, do you see your work fitting into what they seem interested in? You also want to look at payment. You probably aren't going to be paying the bills off literary magazine payments, but some magazines don't pay, others pay a small honorarium, some print magazines will pay per page. In general, you'll find that older magazines that are in print will pay more, whereas newer magazines that are online may not pay at all or may just pay a small honorarium. As well, you might want to think about submission fees. Most magazines you can submit to for free, others will have a small submission fee, And if you're submitting to a contest, then you can expect sometimes a pretty hefty submission fee, $15, $20, even up to $35 sometimes. It's also good to think about if you want to submit to contests versus regular submissions. We do have a video about submitting to contests that I will leave a link to, because there are some nuances there. Typically, if you're just getting started, I would recommend just submitting to regular submissions and not contests, just because with contests, it's a lot narrower, your chances at publication, and you're paying large submission fees. So I don't think it's the best option for someone who's new to submission. You also, of course, want to look at the genres that they publish. A lot of magazines will just publish kind of like general fiction or literary fiction. Others will be very specific, like they publish horror or they publish sci-fi. So if you write in a niche specific genre, you have to make sure that the magazine that you're submitting to is interested in that genre. And then the final thing to think about is author requirements or specific submission calls. A lot of magazines will have specific issues, you know, like for example, we're going to do an issue that's about mental health or something like that. So if you see a specific issue that fits your work and you think you would be an ideal contributor for it, that's great. Sometimes there's specific magazines that are very specific as well. Looking for magazines that cater specifically to your age, your location, your demographic can be a really great way to get started with publication, because there's just inherently going to be fewer people submitting to those magazines, and the editors are specifically looking for authors like you and work like yours. As you submit more and more, you'll kind of find a set of magazines that you really like and that fit your work well and that you can start submitting to routinely until you start to eventually be accepted by them. So this initial stage of having to research to find magazines can seem very overwhelming at first, but you probably won't have to do that for every single piece. And if you are still at that stage where you're just feeling out magazines and trying to find ones that will be a good fit for you, we do have a literary magazine directory that I will leave a link to. To start, you probably want to identify 10 to 15 magazines that you think would be a good fit for the piece that you're submitting, and then break them into tiers of 3 or 4. So with the first tier being your top choice, and then your next highest choice, etc., etc. And the idea is that you're going to submit in tiers. So you're going to submit to your top choice magazines, and then when you get rejected by those, submit to your next highest choice. Step number 2 is to edit thoroughly. Read the piece out loud or try something like word text to speech to make sure there aren't any lingering typos or errors in there. You also want to make sure the piece begins quickly and quickly establishes a concept and direction. If your piece meanders around for several pages, in all likelihood, first readers aren't even going to get past that introductory section. First readers of magazines often don't even read the full piece. If they start reading a piece and the line is really sloppy, or the piece just doesn't get started quickly enough, they probably won't even finish it because they know right away that the piece just isn't strong enough. A piece that begins in a way that is confusing or slow will have a very hard time getting picked up. So try to make sure your inciting incident happens as early as possible, ideally on the first page. And of course, you also want to make sure that you line edit thoroughly for both economy and correctness. Run your piece through word text to speech, or get someone else to proofread it or read it out loud and do that several times. A piece with a messy line level automatically reads like something that is unfinished and isn't polished, and likely will not get picked up. Step number 3 is to format your submission. Now, not all magazines want the same format, so the important thing to do is to check the submission guidelines and make sure you're following the submission guidelines for that particular magazine, and use the formatting specs that they lay out. Now, however, some magazines don't give you any formatting specs. In that case, use a standard font like Times New Roman, use 12-point font and double space your submission, and don't include any identifying information in the document. Most magazines do blind submissions, meaning that they read the piece with no information about the author. So unless a magazine specifically requests biographical information in the actual document, don't include any identification, or else you might be breaking their blind submission policy and the piece will be an auto reject. Step number 4 is to write a cover letter. This is kind of like the literary magazine version of a query letter, but to be honest, it's much simpler and easy to pull together. And once you have a draft of one, you can pretty much use it essentially the same one every single time with just very small edits. First, include your contact info and the magazine's contact info if you can find it. Then begin by personalizing it to the editor. So look up the magazine's masthead and personalize it to the editor-in-chief or the specific genre editor. In the first paragraph, include your story's name, the genre, so saying whether it's a poem or a short story or a flash fiction piece, as well as the word count, and also mention if it's a simultaneous submission or not. Don't try to pitch your story. You don't want to actually put any information about your story concept or plot in the cover letter. The piece should speak for itself, so all you need to do is say the word count, genre, and title, and that's it. Then include a bio where you include things like your previous publications or any other interesting details about yourself. And if you don't have any previous publication credits, you can just say, if accepted, this would be my first published piece. Then just sign off and thank them. You can pretty much use that same cover letter for that same piece every single time. Just make sure you change the names of the magazine and the editor. And the final step is to be patient and keep submitting. Submitting to literary magazines is definitely not a publication option for people who are looking for instant gratification. It can take a very long time. I have a short story coming out in a magazine this month that I submitted last February. So that's a year and a half from clicking submit to the piece being published. And this is just for one short story. Now sometimes the turnaround can be extremely fast, but other times it can be very, very slow. A lot of magazines will take months to get back to you, 3 months, 5 months, even up to a year. And even then, it can be many months, again, sometimes even up to a year before your piece actually appears in the magazine. So it definitely requires some patience, and it also takes some thick skin. Rejection is expected and inevitable. There is no one who's just going to start submitting to literary magazines and get accepted every single time. It's just impossible. It doesn't happen. So don't feel bad if you start to get rejected. It is normal for a piece to be rejected several times before it gets accepted. If you get rejected, just keep your head up and keep submitting to new magazines. Every once in a while, an editor will help you out by giving you a personalized rejection where they explain why they rejected the piece, which might give you some really helpful notes for revision. If after 8 to 10 submissions, you've only gotten rejections, especially if you haven't gotten any personalized rejections at this point, that's when it might be time to reevaluate. Either your piece needs another edit, or you need to reevaluate if the magazines you're submitting to are the right market fit. However, I wouldn't take every single rejection as a sign that something is wrong. It's perfectly normal to submit a piece several times, have it rejected many times before it ends up getting accepted. There are a lot of factors and it can involve a lot of luck, so don't take rejections too personally. A lot of the time, it really just has to do with luck and timing and not getting your piece in front of the right person at the right time. When you eventually get your piece accepted, you want to withdraw from all other magazines. With literary magazines, it really is first come, first serve. The first magazine to accept your piece gets your piece. If your piece gets accepted, you can't just say, oh, 1 second, I'm just waiting back to hear if I get an offer from someone else. That's not how it works. The first person to accept it is the first person to get it. And it's important that you withdraw the piece from all the other magazines who have it. If you don't, they can get pretty annoyed if they end up accepting you, and then you have to say, oh, sorry, the piece isn't available. So do a courtesy of just withdrawing your piece and you can move forward with your publication. Now, what if you do if you feel like you're not having any luck submitting a piece to literary magazines? Some pieces get picked up super fast, others will just be really difficult. Everyone I know who submits to literary magazines has those pieces that just don't seem to be clicking with editors. They just get rejected over and over and over. I have a couple of these that just piled in the rejections, so many of them. So what do you do if that happens? Either you need to edit the piece, or you may want to consider other publication options. You can publish yourself on a blog or even as an ebook, or you can just decide to save the piece for an eventual collection. You'll want to have new unpublished pieces in a collection anyways, or if you like, you can even try self-publishing a collection yourself if you'd rather have all your stories published as a manuscript that you have full control over, rather than going through this long process of submitting it to literary magazines. So that is how to submit to literary magazines. My question for this video is, what are your favorite magazines to read and submit to, especially if they're online? Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Friday on this channel. Until next time, bye.